Have you ever heard of a war that started not because of politics, religion, or greed, but because of a pig? No, seriously. A single pig. Just one. It sounds like something out of a comedy sketch, right? Like some bizarre tale your history teacher tells at the end of the semester just to make you laugh. But this actually happened. And it wasn't just a little fight either. It nearly turned into a war between two global powers, the British Empire and the United States, over one pig. And when you hear that, it's hard not to laugh. But once you dig deeper, once you look at the full story, what was really going on behind the scenes, you realize that this wasn't just about a pig. The pig was just the spark. Underneath it all, this was about pride, power, territory, and two nations that were just waiting for a reason to fight. Let's rewind to 1859. The world was changing fast. On one side, you had the British Empire, massive, powerful, and confident. The sun never set on British land, and they liked it that way. On the other side, the United States, young, ambitious, and growing fast. It was a country with something to prove. And between these two giants, stuck in a gray area of forgotten treaties and unclear borders, was a little island no one had really paid much attention to, San Juan Island. Now, if you look at a modern map, San Juan Island is part of Washington State. A peaceful little place with cute homes, nature trails, and ferry rides. But in 1859, it was anything but peaceful. It was a time when maps weren't as clear, and treaties were often vague. And because of one of those vague treaties, the Oregon Treaty of 1846, both the British and the Americans believed they had the rightful claim to the island. The treaty said the border would run along the middle of the channel between Vancouver Island and the mainland. Sounds simple, right? It wasn't, because there were two possible channels and San Juan Island sat smack in the middle. Neither side wanted to back down. Both claimed it as theirs. And so, settlers from both countries started moving in. British settlers were mostly tied to the Hudson's Bay Company. These weren't just casual citizens. They were part of a powerful fur trading empire that stretched across the Canadian wilderness. They brought sheep to the island and set up a ranch. On the other hand, American settlers, most of them farmers, began arriving too, each one planting a flag of sorts with their cabin, their crops, and their quiet belief that this land would eventually become part of the United States. So what you had was this awkward, uneasy coexistence. Two groups of people living on the same island, each thinking the other didn't belong. There were no official government buildings, no border markers, just tension. Imagine two neighbors who both think the front yard belongs to them. One's planting flowers, the other's parking a car on it. And every day they avoid eye contact, but everyone knows it's going to boil over eventually. And then the pig came in. It belonged to a British settler named Charles Griffin. He worked for the Hudson's Bay Company and let his pigs roam free, like it was open pasture. To him, it probably didn't seem like a big deal. Let the animals wander, they'll come back. But to the American farmers trying to grow crops, it was a nightmare. Imagine working day and night to plant a tiny patch of potatoes, and then a fat pig waddles in and eats everything. That's what happened to Lyman Cutlar, an American farmer who had just started trying to make a life on the island. He'd warned Griffin before, told him to keep the pig away, but nothing changed. And on one particular day in June 1859, after finding the pig feasting on his potatoes again, Lyman snapped. He grabbed his rifle and shot the pig dead. That single gunshot echoed much further than anyone expected. At first, it was just a dispute between neighbors. Griffin was furious. He demanded compensation, $100. That was a lot of money back then. Lyman thought that was ridiculous and offered 10. Griffin refused. Word started to spread, and like wildfire, the pig story lit up both communities. But here's the thing, this wasn't really about the pig anymore. Not for the settlers, and definitely not for the governments watching from afar. For the Americans, this was just more proof that the British didn't respect their claim to the island. For the British, it was a reminder that the Americans were getting too bold, too willing to use violence on territory they didn't officially own. Soon, local American officials were notified, and they didn't just send an apology or a note. They sent troops. Yes, real soldiers, with weapons. And that's when everything began to spiral out of control. You see, on the surface, this might seem like a story about two angry settlers, a pig, and a few misunderstandings. But it was more than that. Much more. Because what was really happening here was a power struggle. A territorial standoff. And both sides, British and American, had been waiting for a moment like this. Something to justify a show of strength. Something to prove who really owned this place. And the pig gave them that excuse. Now imagine being on that island during those first few days after the shooting. You're a settler just trying to grow food and survive. And suddenly, American soldiers are marching into the woods. You hear them digging trenches, setting up camp. You see ships in the water, British ships, armed, serious, and all because someone shot a pig. It must have felt surreal, like the whole world had lost its mind. But the scary part? It was just beginning, because once the soldiers arrived, neither side wanted to back down. Pride was on the line now, and pride in history is often more dangerous than any weapon. The British didn't sit around either. They sent in their own forces, not just a few troops, warships, massive ones, floating giants of iron and fire, ready to unleash hell at the first sign of provocation. And here's the terrifying thing, there were no clear rules, no official orders. Both sides were just waiting, watching, and hoping the other would blink first. But history shows us that when both sides are armed, angry, and proud, it doesn't take much for things to turn deadly. And all of this chaos, started because one pig walked into the wrong garden. But now the world was watching, and the next move would decide everything. When the first American troops set foot on San Juan Island, everything changed. What had started as a ridiculous argument over one dead pig suddenly took on the shape of a much bigger and far more dangerous conflict. The man leading the American soldiers was Captain George Pickett. At the time, he wasn't famous yet. He was just another officer trying to rise through the ranks, looking for an opportunity to prove himself. And here, on this foggy island with nothing but sheep, potato fields, and tension in the air, he saw his chance. Pickett arrived with a small detachment, 66 men from the 9th Infantry Regiment. Not exactly a massive army, but in a situation like this, it wasn't about numbers. It was about sending a message. And the message was loud and clear. The United States wasn't going to back down. They claimed San Juan Island as theirs, and they were ready to protect it, even if that meant standing face to face with the world's most powerful empire. The moment British officials got word that U.S. troops had landed, alarms went off. The Royal Navy was immediately dispatched, and they didn't send scouts or diplomats. They sent warships, 3 of them, fully armed, anchored just off the coast. Their cannons pointed toward land, toward the Americans. There it was, 2 flags, 2 camps, 2 nations, 1 tiny island, and in the middle of it all, farmers, ranchers, and a whole lot of people who probably just wanted to be left alone. You can imagine the tension. Soldiers digging trenches, setting up tents, staring at each other across open fields. One wrong move, one nervous finger on a trigger, and that island would have become a battlefield. But somehow, at least in those first few days, everyone held back. No one fired the first shot. But that didn't mean it wasn't close. American reinforcements started arriving. More troops, more guns. They even brought artillery. Pickett was preparing for a real fight. He made speeches to his men, called the island American soil, told them to stand their ground no matter what. On the other side, the British commanders were growing uneasy. They didn't want to start a war, but they also couldn't let the Americans act like they owned the place. Admiral Robert Baines was the man in charge of the British naval forces in the region. When he saw the situation, he had a choice to make. He could open fire, wipe out the American camp in a matter of minutes, or he could wait. Baines was a veteran. He'd seen what war did. He wasn't about to start a full-blown conflict over livestock. So he held back. He made one of the hardest decisions a man in his position could make. He refused to engage. No shots. No invasion. Not yet. And so, for a few days, then weeks, the standoff continued. 2 armed groups just existing next to each other. Watching. Waiting. But things were fragile. Very fragile. All it would take was one hot-headed soldier. One accidental discharge. One misunderstanding. And there were misunderstandings. British sailors stepped too close to American lines. American soldiers aimed their rifles. Tensions flared. But somehow, each time someone pulled the others back. Cooler heads, for now, were barely winning. Meanwhile, word of the standoff had reached both Washington and London. And neither capital was thrilled. In Washington, D.C., President James Buchanan had a nightmare on his hands. The country was already in chaos. Slavery debates were tearing the nation apart. The Civil War was right around the corner. The last thing America needed was to fight the British again. In London, the mood wasn't much better. The British Empire was stretched thin, dealing with uprisings and wars in India, Africa, and Asia. A war with the US would mean another front. Another drain. And for what? An island no one back home had ever heard of? But while the leaders debated and delayed, the soldiers stayed put. On the ground, they kept building, kept training, kept aiming. There were nights when the tension was so thick, even the animals stopped making noise. Campfires glowed faintly in the dark. Muskets rested by sleeping bags. Commanders paced. The sound of boots in mud. Metal scraping against metal. The constant hum of war that hadn't started but might at any second. Still, no one fired. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. And slowly, something strange began to happen. The soldiers started talking. Not officially. Not in any official capacity. But British and American officers would meet near the neutral zones. Trade news. Share supplies. Even laugh a little. There are stories of soldiers playing games, passing tobacco, swapping stories about home, because in the end, they weren't that different. Just men far from home, stuck in a situation none of them had asked for. Back home, negotiations dragged on. Diplomats scribbled letters. Politicians argued about borders and treaties from desks hundreds of miles away. But on the island, things were calming down. Not exactly peaceful, but manageable. And yet, the threat was still there. Because nothing had been settled. The troops were still there. The guns were still loaded. The island was still claimed by two empires. And the pig, the poor, fat, potato-loving pig, was still dead. But somehow, war hadn't come. Not yet. And in that silence, between the pig and the paperwork, a strange kind of limbo settled over San Juan Island. Calm that could break at any moment. You'd think that after months of staring each other down, something would eventually snap, that someone would lose their patience, pull the trigger, and let history write itself in blood and smoke. But no, not yet. Instead, San Juan Island slipped into one of the strangest standoffs in history, a place where war could start at any moment, but somehow never did. Two armies, standing within rifle range of each other. Cannons pointed, tents pitched, soldiers marching. And yet, every day that passed without a shot fired made the silence feel heavier. People started calling it the bloodless war, at least for now. But it wasn't peaceful. Not really. It was just quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like the air's holding its breath. Captain George Pickett, the American officer in command, had now made his position very clear. The island was American territory. He wasn't budging. In fact, he requested even more reinforcements. Not just to defend, but to hold. To plant a flag. To make sure the British understood that this wasn't some passing moment of tension. This was a declaration, silent but firm. He wrote home with pride. Told his superiors he'd defend the island against the entire British Empire. That's a bold thing to say, especially when you're outnumbered and surrounded by warships. But Pickett wasn't just any officer. He had ambition. He wanted glory. And he didn't mind pushing the line to get it. Across the field, on the British side, Admiral Baines and Governor James Douglas were watching everything closely. And they weren't happy. Baines, especially, was walking a dangerous tightrope. He had the ships. He had the men. If he gave the order, the American camp could be wiped off the map in less than an hour. He knew that. But what would come after? War? Retaliation? Another 1812? Governor Douglas was even more aggressive. He wanted action. He believed the Americans were invading British territory. In his view, this wasn't just a pig problem, it was an occupation. He demanded a stronger response. Something visible, something loud, maybe even something explosive. But Admiral Baines held his ground. He wasn't about to be the man who started a war over a misunderstanding, even if everyone around him was pressuring him to do just that. Still, things weren't cooling down. Far from it. In fact, the British started sending more troops. Royal Marines marching off the warships and into the forested hills. They set up camp not far from the Americans. Not close enough to provoke, but not far enough to ignore. It was like a slow, silent chess match. Each side moving one piece at a time. No talking, no trust. And in the middle, the civilians, the settlers, farmers, families, ranchers, who had just wanted a patch of land to grow food, raise livestock, and live a quiet life. Now they were caught between two armies, and they didn't know who to trust. Some Americans were furious at their own government. Why risk war over a piece of land most people had never even heard of? Others supported the army. They believed this was their right, their land, their destiny. Manifest destiny, they called it back then. The belief that the United States was meant to stretch from sea to sea. And San Juan Island was part of that vision, even if it came with warships parked on the horizon. The British settlers weren't much different. Many of them had lived under the Hudson's Bay Company for years. Their loyalty was to Crown and Company. But they weren't soldiers. They were sheep herders, craftsmen, traders. They didn't want gunfire echoing through their pastures. They just wanted things to go back to the way they were before that cursed pig ate the wrong potatoes. And speaking of the pig, its story started to spread. Not just on the island, but across the continent, and even across the ocean. Newspapers picked it up. The pig that started a war. Island crisis escalates over slain swine. It sounded too ridiculous to be real. And yet, it was real. As real as the bayonets glinting in the island sun. But even as the press made light of the situation, the men on the ground knew better. They saw the gunpowder. They felt the tension. They knew how quickly things could spiral out of control. And it wasn't just the military leaders holding the line anymore. The governments finally got involved. Washington and London were now fully aware that a single incident, small as it seemed, had created an international crisis. Diplomats started working overtime. Letters were sent. Negotiators were dispatched. Everyone wanted the same thing, a peaceful solution. But no one wanted to lose face. No one wanted to back down first. Because backing down meant admitting you were wrong. And in the 19th century, no empire liked to admit weakness. So the standoff continued. For days, then weeks, then months. But something strange happened during that time. The soldiers, those tough, disciplined men brought there to fight, started adapting. At first, they were just watching, then talking, then joking, then trading goods across the lines. Some even shared meals. There were stories of American soldiers being invited to British camps for tea. British officers tipping their hats to American scouts in the morning. The enemy lines began to blur. Not in command or structure, but in spirit. The men no longer saw each other as enemies, just neighbors, caught in the same ridiculous waiting game. They even organized a few games. Baseball, wrestling matches, singing contests, things that reminded them they were human, not just chess pieces in someone else's game. But that too was fragile, because no matter how friendly the soldiers became, the guns were still loaded, the flags still flew, the politicians were still arguing. And war? War was still just one mistake away. One gunshot, one spark, one more pig. At some point, you start to ask yourself, what are we even doing here? It had been months now. Soldiers on both sides were still stationed on San Juan Island. The British had their red-coated Marines, disciplined and polished, standing guard near their ship camps. The Americans had infantrymen in worn blue uniforms, huddled around campfires, checking rifles that had never been fired. They were still staring each other down, but now it felt less like a standoff and more like a ritual. Wake up, drill, patrol, eat, Watch the other side. Repeat. But even rituals get dangerous when pride is involved. Because the thing about this pig war is that it was never really about the pig. That was just the excuse. The gateway. What this conflict was really about was something much deeper, much older. Something that history doesn't always like to admit. This was about empire. By 1859, the British Empire was still at the top of the world. Their navy ruled the seas. Their colonies stretched across continents. And they were used to getting their way. But in the West, the United States was rising fast. It had doubled in size in just a few decades. It had taken Mexico's northern lands. It was looking toward the Pacific. Hungry, bold, and it wasn't afraid to step on some British toes to get what it wanted. The island, San Juan, wasn't valuable because of what it was. It was valuable because of what it represented. Control, dominance, the future. So even though nobody wanted to be the one to pull the trigger, neither side wanted to be the one to blink. And this is where things started to get dangerous. Because the longer the standoff dragged on, the more pressure built up, especially back home. In Washington, President Buchanan's cabinet was split. Some officials wanted to push the British back, to use the incident as an excuse to claim the island permanently. Others were panicking. War with Britain would mean disaster. The country was already falling apart from the inside. The tensions between the North and South were boiling. Slavery, secession, civil war was on the horizon. If the US entered into a foreign conflict now, it could tear the country in two. In London, things weren't much better. Parliament wasn't about to let the Americans push them off an island they believed was rightfully British. That would be a humiliation. And humiliation, in politics, can be just as dangerous as actual defeat. But a war with the US across the ocean? Expensive, ugly, and politically risky. So what happened? The diplomats stepped in. Finally, they had no choice. If they didn't, war would become inevitable. So both sides sent representatives. Long letters, carefully worded dispatches. Everything from naval maps to old treaties were brought back to the table. They pulled out the original Oregon Treaty from 1846 and started dissecting it word by word, trying to figure out what the middle of the channel actually meant. Meanwhile, back on the island, the soldiers were still playing baseball. They didn't know it yet, but their strange little war was turning into something even stranger. A shared story. By this point, many of the men had become friends. Not in an official sense, there was still no crossing the lines without permission, but unofficially they talked. Shared gossip. Traded coffee for tobacco. Swapped buttons from uniforms. There were even jokes. One British officer reportedly said, "If we do go to war, I hope it waits until after tonight's supper. We're having roast duck." It was surreal, but also tense, because not everyone was laughing. Some commanders on both sides were growing impatient. The American reinforcements had grown to over 400 men. 400 troops on a foggy island, armed and waiting. The British had increased their presence too. Baines was still holding off, still refusing to fire the first shot. But people back in British Columbia, and even some officers under his command, were getting restless. They wanted action, wanted to send a message. And Pickett? He was loving it. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. A real command. A chance to stand up to an empire. His name was in the papers. His reports were being passed around Washington. He was a hero now to some, a troublemaker to others. But either way, people were watching him. That's when things took a darker turn. One evening, a group of American soldiers on patrol spotted a British scout near their lines. He wasn't doing anything suspicious, just watching, maybe lost. But the Americans raised their rifles, shouted. The scout panicked and bolted. Someone almost fired. 1 second later, and this would be a very different story. But again, restraint. One more moment of calm in a crisis full of tension. Still, word of the incident spread fast. Rumors flew. The British were spying. The Americans almost shot a diplomat. They're preparing for battle. None of it confirmed. All of it dangerous. And through all of this, the island remained in limbo. There were no civilians moving in or out. No real law. No government. Just two foreign armies standing across from each other in a kind of ghost war. Real enough to kill, but quiet enough to ignore. Yet the longer it went on, the more it became clear that this couldn't last. Something had to give. Someone had to end it. Because war, even when it doesn't happen, still leaves scars. It still costs money, time, sanity. It still breaks men, sometimes in silence. And the pig? Long forgotten, buried, eaten, whatever. It wasn't about him anymore. Now it was about the border, the channel, the empire, the idea of who gets to own what and why. And just like that, the question returned to London and Washington again. How far are we willing to go for something we might not even want? Because the next decision could change the future, not just of a small island, but of two nations. And all it would take is one word. Yes or no. War or peace. It's a strange feeling, waiting for a war that never quite comes. By late 1859, San Juan Island had become something no one really expected. A frozen battlefield. The soldiers were still there. The camps still stood. Flags still flew, and weapons remained loaded. But the war? It was like a ghost hovering above them, always close, never touching. But that tension wasn't free. Every day the standoff dragged on, it drained both sides. Not just in money, but in morale, in credibility. And back in the capitals, patience was starting to run out. In Washington, D.C., the government was teetering on the edge of a national collapse. Slavery had become the issue no one could ignore. Southern states were threatening to break away. And while the president's men tried to calm the storm, they also had this ridiculous pig war still unresolved in the background. To many, it seemed like a distraction. But to others, especially those who supported westward expansion, it was something symbolic. A message. If America couldn't defend its claim to one tiny island, what kind of power was it becoming? Over in London, the British were just as exhausted. Queen Victoria's ministers were juggling colonial unrest in India, military costs in Africa, and trade deals in Asia. Now some half-frozen island in the Pacific Northwest was making headlines because of a dead farm animal? It was embarrassing. But at the same time, giving up the island felt like surrendering to American aggression. They couldn't afford to look weak. Not to the Americans. Not to their own empire. Not to the world. So what do you do when neither side wants to start a war, but neither side wants to back down? You do what empires have always done when they want to look civil. You pass the problem to someone else. And that's exactly what happened. In 1871, yes, 12 years after the pig was shot, the United States and Britain agreed to submit the boundary dispute to arbitration. But not just any arbitration. They needed a third party. Someone powerful, neutral, respected. So who did they pick? Kaiser Wilhelm I, the Emperor of Germany. Germany was still young then, a recently unified country with growing power in Europe. Wilhelm was seen as a fair, modern monarch. He didn't have skin in the game. And more importantly, both the US and Britain trusted him enough to abide by whatever he decided. So they handed him everything. The maps, the treaties, the letters, the naval records, and of course the arguments, dozens of them, each side explaining why that island was rightfully theirs, why the channel mentioned in the 1846 treaty meant this body of water, not that one, why San Juan belonged to them, pig or no pig. And then, they waited. Back on the island, nothing really changed. The troops were still there, but things had settled into routine. Some soldiers were being rotated out. Others had been stationed so long, they'd grown gardens. There were even weddings. Children were born during the occupation. Imagine that, being born into a war that never started. There's a strange kind of peace that comes when both sides are too embarrassed to fight. Everyone just wants it to end, but no one wants to say it out loud. Then, in 1872, the verdict came. Kaiser Wilhelm's commission ruled in favor of the United States. The reasoning was simple. According to the maps and the treaty language, the boundary should follow the Harrow Strait, the deeper channel to the west of San Juan Island. And that put the island firmly within American territory. Just like that, it was over. No speeches, no parades, no bloodshed, The British quietly packed up their things. Their Marines left. Their banners were lowered. Their ships pulled anchor and sailed away. And the Americans? They stayed. It's hard to say how the soldiers felt in that moment. Maybe relief, maybe pride, maybe a little confusion. After all, they'd spent over a decade defending this island, waiting for a war that never happened. And now it was just over. No battle, no victory, just a decision made thousands of miles away. And the strangest part? No one really won. Sure, the US got the island, but it had cost them years of manpower, political distraction, and money they desperately needed elsewhere. The British avoided war, yes, but lost face in the process. Some in Parliament were furious. They felt the empire had given up too easily. Others just shook their heads and asked the same question everyone else was asking. Was it really worth it? All of this over a pig? A pig that wandered into a garden. A farmer who'd had a bad day. A rifle shot. A pile of ruined potatoes. And from that, soldiers, warships, international diplomacy, and 12 years of silent occupation. It would be funny if it weren't so painfully true, because what the Pig War really revealed wasn't just the absurdity of empires or the silliness of standoffs. It revealed how fragile peace can be, how quickly pride and politics can turn a tiny incident into a global crisis, how often history brushes right past disaster, and no one even notices until it's over. They called it a bloodless war, but that's not exactly true. Maybe no one died in combat, but thousands of lives were shaped by that moment. Troops separated from families, settlers caught between armies, millions spent on supplies, deployments, and wasted time, and all because two nations couldn't admit they were standing on shaky ground. In the end, maybe the pig wasn't the real trigger at all. Maybe it was just a mirror showing the world how ridiculous things can get when pride outruns reason. For years after the Pig War ended, no one quite knew what to do with it. How do you talk about a war that never technically happened? A conflict that had armies, ships, soldiers, and years of standoff. Yet not a single shot fired? It didn't fit the usual story of heroism or conquest. There were no dramatic last stands, no glorious charges, no famous battles to put in the textbooks, just a dead pig and thousands of soldiers who waited for orders that never came. At first, it was mostly forgotten, a footnote in official reports, a strange little border dispute that never quite caught fire, the kind of thing historians would glance at, maybe chuckle, and move on. But over time, the story started to take on a new kind of power, because when you look closer, really look, you start to see just how close the world came to disaster. You start to realize how many of history's most dangerous moments don't come from big decisions, but small ones. Tiny sparks, a pig, potato patch, a single rifle shot. And more importantly, you start to see how fragile peace can be. The Pig War wasn't just about a pig. It was about timing, ego, empire, the pressure to act tough in front of the world. And most terrifying of all, it was about the fact that no one was really in control. Think about it. The local American farmer who shot the pig. He didn't want to start a war. He just wanted to protect his crops. The British settler who owned the pig? He wanted compensation, not a naval blockade. Captain Pickett? Sure, he loved the spotlight, but he wasn't planning to become the spark of an international crisis. He just didn't want to be the one who blinked. And the soldiers on both sides, many of them were barely in their 20s. They weren't thinking about geopolitics. They were thinking about surviving winter, about writing letters home, about boredom, fear, loneliness. No one person caused the crisis, and no one person could stop it either. And that is what makes it so terrifying. Because what if Baines had fired those cannons? What if Pickett had given the wrong order? What if that British scout had been shot? Everything was in place. The weapons, the numbers, the justification. It wouldn't have been called the Pig War. It would have been called something much darker, something bloodier, something children would learn about in school, next to the War of 1812 or the Mexican-American War. And that's the lesson most people miss. The Pig War isn't funny because of how it started. It's horrifying because of how close it came to something much worse. We like to laugh at it now, And sure, on the surface, it feels absurd. The headlines practically write themselves. Two nations nearly go to war over a pig. It's the kind of thing people post memes about. The kind of story late-night shows might turn into a sketch. But buried underneath the laughter is something else. Something colder. This wasn't the only time a war nearly broke out over something small. It happened in 1914 too, when a teenage assassin killed an archduke in Sarajevo. That tiny spark led to World War I. Millions dead. Empires collapsed. All from one moment of chaos. And yet, the pig war didn't go that way. Why? Because, just barely, people paused. Just barely, they chose to wait. Just barely, they decided that war wasn't worth it. And that's rare. History is full of wars that shouldn't have happened. Rarely do we get one that didn't. That's what makes San Juan Island special. Not the size of the armies. Not the length of the standoff. But the fact that, against all odds, it ended in silence. No explosions. No mass graves. Just a ruling. A flag change. And then, nothing. Of course, the soldiers didn't know that at the time. Many of them lived the rest of their lives unsure if they'd done something meaningful or just wasted years of their youth on a mistake. Some never talked about it again. Others kept mementos, British buttons, American belt buckles, dried wildflowers from the island. Little souvenirs from a war that technically never happened. The island itself remained quiet for decades. Slowly, the old camps disappeared. The trenches overgrew. The British cemetery still stands there today, a quiet field with a few worn headstones, marking the resting places of men who never saw battle, but served in the shadow of one. Tourists visit now. They take photos of the pig war signs. They hear the story told with a smile, a quirky bit of local trivia. Fun fact, but if they stood still, really still, and listened to the wind cutting across the grass, they might hear something else. The hum of tension that never left. The echo of cannon barrels that were almost fired. The weight of what could have been. And maybe that's why this story matters. Because in a world where we're taught that history is shaped by war, conquest, and bloodshed, this is a rare case where the greatest victory was not fighting at all. No heroes. No villains. Just a pig. Two flags. And a choice. A choice to pause. To breathe. To wait. And in the silence that followed, peace held. Barely. It's easy to look back on history and think it's all neat and logical. That there's a reason for everything. That wars happen because of strategy, diplomacy, resources, big decisions made by powerful people in high towers. But history rarely works that way. More often, it stumbles. It slips. It gets triggered by the smallest things. A misread message. A wrong name. A single spark. Or in this case, a hungry pig. That's the uncomfortable truth buried beneath the laughter. We like stories to make sense. We want a hero, a villain, a dramatic ending. But the real world doesn't work like that. The pig war didn't have a battle. It didn't have a dramatic final moment. It just stopped. Quietly. Awkwardly. Like two men arguing in the street, ready to throw punches, until one of them just walks away. And that's what makes it so important. Because sometimes, nothing happening is the biggest story of all. We often forget how close we are, always, to catastrophe. How many conflicts in the past started with less than this? A royal insult. Family grudge. A few bad maps. The murder of one archduke in a back alley started World War I. A trade argument and some tariffs sparked the Opium Wars. A single cup of tea in the wrong place triggered a rebellion in India. The pig war? That was a moment when history could have split. When the world could have unraveled. British ships were in firing position. American soldiers had their rifles cocked. Orders were being written, revised, shredded, rewritten again. And still it held. Why? Because a few people, just enough, chose not to escalate. Because Admiral Baines chose patience. Because Kaiser Wilhelm, of all people, decided to settle a border without blood. Because even in the fog of ego and pride, someone kept their finger off the trigger. And maybe that's the real lesson here. We tend to glorify wars. We remember the great battles, the body counts, the marches and victories. But we rarely tell the stories of the wars that didn't happen. of the conflicts that almost exploded and then didn't. No medals were handed out for the pig war. No monuments. No national holidays. But maybe there should be, because restraint, true restraint, is harder than revenge. And choosing peace doesn't make headlines. But it does change the future. Imagine if it had gone the other way. If that first cannon had fired. Would Britain and the US have slipped into another full-blown war? Would it have changed how the American Civil War played out just a couple years later? Would the balance of global power have shifted? Would thousands have died? All because of one clumsy animal and two men with too much pride? History is full of what-ifs. And this might be the most absurd and the most haunting. Today, San Juan Island is peaceful. Tourists take ferries in. Families picnic on the hills where soldiers once stood with bayonets in the rain. There's a British camp preserved as a historical park. An American one too. Both are quiet now. Just wooden signs and reconstructed barracks. But if you stand there long enough, you can feel it. The weight of what almost happened. The cold breath of war that passed by, close enough to feel, but never close enough to burn. And all of it because of a pig. So the next time someone tells you history is boring, tell them about San Juan. Tell them about the standoff that lasted over a decade. About soldiers who trained for battle but ended up playing baseball. About a war that was fought over pride, drawn weapons, and a dead farm animal, and somehow ended in silence. Not every story needs blood to leave a scar. Some scars are made of the wars that didn't happen. And those are often the most important of all.